take it away.
Okay, so we have finally reached the end of our recapping of our Bible study, going through the beginning of Genesis, or at least retreading our steps. And so tonight, uh, Kyle, you were looking to give us some more info on your particular view of hell, this view that you have pioneered.
Yeah, yeah,
And so
pioneer.
so first and foremost, I think it would be good if you were to tell us what your view of hell is and explain it for us.
Yes. Okay. So, um, I refer to this as the asymptotic view of hell. Um, you guys on the call can't see this, but it's in the recording. Um, which, see, so unprofessional. I should have just done that. Boom. There. Can you guys see that? Yeah. Okay. So,
Mhm,
um, the reason why it's called asymptotic view is because uh, it's a model of how where you should think of it um, in terms of an asymptote. So an asymptote is in mathematics is whenever in one dimension um, uh, it there's probably a more general definition, but in one dimension, typically it's going off to infinity, and then in the other dimension, it is approaching a target, and it never actually reaches that target. So the easiest example of that is something always reaching zero. And so the easiest equation that can model that is over here. So I have f of x, and if you're in more basic math, they'll put a y right here. So you can do y equals 1 over x, or f of x equals 1 over x. That graph looks like this. And um, as you can see, I have put time on one axis and consciousness on the other. I'll get more into that in a bit. But as you go on in time, as you go out, this graph will get closer and closer to zero, but won't actually reach it. Um, and so basically, my model is that when a person uh, goes to hell, um, they are conscious the entire time. Um, that hell is eternal, but their consciousness uh, is not always at 100%. So, a more proper model for my view is this graph down here below. Um, So you can see that the number starts at 1. So whenever time equals 0, so let's say this is the first instance of hell, their consciousness is 100%. And then as time goes on, their consciousness uh, scales down, and will keep scaling down towards 0 forever, but it won't actually reach 0. Um, and so pretty much the only um, in order for my view to work, you kind of just need to affirm two basic ideas. The first one is that consciousness uh, is continuous and not discrete. So continuous means that right. So everybody's familiar with the gender is on a spectrum. It's not binary, right? I'm not saying I agree with that, but I'm saying that that is sort of what I'm using for thinking about consciousness. I think most people, whenever they think about consciousness, they think about it in discrete terms. Either you are conscious or you are not conscious, and um, I think that that's, as we might get into later, I think that's one of the main problems for why No one else has ever really conceived of a model of hell like this, is because people tend to think about consciousness as being uh, discrete on or off state. Um, but if you think about it as being continuous or more of a spectrum, and that you could have percentages of the amount that you are conscious, um, then my model is plausible. Uh, and an easy example of this is just, okay, think about, so we're awake right now. Maybe that's 100% conscious. Um, but you also, there are times where you're asleep. So sleep is not 100% unconscious. You are somewhat conscious while asleep, right? Because you can think and dream and all of this stuff. And as you're transitioning between wakefulness and being asleep, there's a transition period, right, where you become more conscious or less conscious. And you can have deeper levels of sleep. You can be knocked out by anesthesia and all this stuff. Or you can be flat out dead, right? Which flat out dead, right? There's no brain activity, right? Um, and and so uh, there is like a definite 0 point, but there's also a gradient there, and so um, that that's probably the first and main um, thing that you would need to agree with on my view in order to adopt my view. Um, the second point that I think you would need to agree with in order to adopt my view is the idea that um, the amount of suffering that a person experiences is related to how conscious they are. Um, and I can do a pretty simple example of this. Um, right, your if you are fully awake and you stick your hand on a hot stove, that hurts a bunch. Um, if you are knocked out in anesthesia and you stick your hand on a stove, you don't suffer as much because you're not conscious of it, right? You might be later, but it's going to be even then the amount of pain that you feel and the amount of suffering that you have is going to be less than if you had been fully awake. And also, the only reason why you're experiencing it is because you have come out of that unconscious state and you have become conscious again, right? And so the level of suffering that you experience is related to how conscious you are. Um, and so, uh, and it's also related to the amount of time that you experience it. So, um, basically, if you want to find out how, if you right, we don't have actual measurements for these things, but if you want to find out how what's the total amount of suffering that you experienced in some period of time, right? And I don't have units and measurements of this, but basically what you would do is you would take the amount that you are conscious and the amount of time that you experienced it, and you multiply those things together. And in mathematics, uh, whenever you that's not a straight like linear shape or whatever, you do what's called an integral. And so you take an integral a um, over a function, and that gives you the total amount of whatever it is that you're modeling or measuring. And so if you took the integral over this time period from this time to this time, um, you you basically you get the area under that curve. However much area is under that curve, that's the amount of whatever the thing is that you're measuring. In this case, that's going to be total amount of suffering. And so, um, like uh, if you look at this, the main chart, the real chart, there's a bunch of rules about whether or not you can do integrals and all that stuff. I'm going to try and ignore a lot of that here unless we really want to get into it. But basically, it gives you this chart This is kind of a starting point. This is more or less my endpoint. Um, and uh, what this gives us a system that is eternal in one dimension, or is infinite in one dimension, in this case time. So it's eternal. That's what eternal means, an infinite amount of time. And it's finite in the amount of suffering. The area under this curve is finite. And so that's that combination of two things is what's unique to my view. Um, yeah.
Okay, so let's go ahead and you can choose and answer the second part of this question now or not, but I'll pose it both to you. How did you come to think of this view, and what problem exactly are you trying to solve with this view?
Yeah. Um, so there's a common critique of the Christian view of hell, which is that um, how can there be an infinite amount of suffering in hell for a person that can only commit a finite amount of sins? So it doesn't matter how long you live. It doesn't matter um, how how many terrible. It doesn't matter how you could perform a million holocausts, right? It doesn't matter how terrible the things that you do, whatever it is, because we don't live an infinite amount of time. We can only commit a finite amount of sins. So whatever it is that we do, we only commit a finite amount of sins. Therefore, doesn't it make sense that we should only suffer a finite amount of suffering in hell? And I think so. This is a very popular critique. You can find this on atheist YouTube videos all over the place. Um, and I think a lot of Christians' reaction is to find a way to just sort of dismiss that critique. But I think at a very deep level, um, everybody kind of understands that actually this critique sort of works. Um, uh, there's um, there's a book that we talked about, which is The Four Views of Hell. And whenever you read that book, whenever you listen to other popular apologists, that whenever they talk about hell, um, pretty much all of them will come up with some kind of rationale, some kind of way in which they address that question. Um, and we can talk about that more in subsequent videos. But for now, I would just say that um, for me, basically, I didn't like anybody's answer. I thought everybody's answer um, for all the views, eternal conscious torment, conditionalist, universalist, I thought everybody's answer to that question was uh, not very good. Um, so that so just the way that I work, whenever I'm doing stuff with this, usually stuff sticks with me and I sit and think about it for a really long time. So that's one of the things that always stuck with me and for a really long time. And the other thing that stuck with me for a really long time is just there was always something eating at the back of my head of um, this idea of uh, because you have an infinite amount of time, therefore you have an infinite amount of suffering. And I think I always knew that there was something off with that, but it took me a long while to piece together um, what exactly that was. And sort of one of my bases for this, which it took me a while to kind of link it to the idea of consciousness and consciousness specifically being discrete. But there's kind of a famous math joke which goes, uh, an infinite number of mathematicians walk into a bar and the first one goes up to the bartender and goes, "I'd like one beer." And the next mathematician goes up to the bartender and goes, "I would like a half a beer." And the next one goes up to the bartender and goes, "I would like a quarter of a beer." And then after after a few more of these, the bartender pours two beers and pushes them over to the mathematician and says, "Here, you figure it out." And The point of that joke is that um uh he doesn't he doesn't necessarily know how to divvy it up, right, for every single mathematician, but he knows precisely what I'm talking about. He knows the area under the curve. The area that's called a geometric series. He knows the area under that curve. The area under that curve is 2. It can that thing converges to 2. And so just because it's infinite in one dimension doesn't mean that in another dimension it's also infinite. So in this case, it's infinite in the number of patrons and the number of people that are ordering beer, but the total amount of beer that they're ordering is a finite amount. Um, and so yeah, that's sort of both why and how I kind of came to thinking about it like this.
Okay, so, like, to sum that up, it pretty much came to you in a gap that you saw in apologetics, like, debates,
Yes,
um,
yes.
and you saw a potential solution to cover that. Um, okay. Um, and I know that for you, this is more than just, like, a theoretical view, that you also, like, you pioneered this view and you believe this view
Yeah,
personally. And so why do you think this view is true?
yeah, okay. So Um, I think it's true because I think so for two reasons. Um, I I I do agree with intuition, and for whenever it comes to theology. So I think intuitively, once you understand the view, I think it makes sense. Um, of because like that fundamental that problem that I talked about that atheists tend to have with the view that's that's a fundamental um human beings have a fundamental intuition for justice, right? And we think that things should be fair, right? And like I said, and every single time and that's pretty universal. Like if you think about or if you go and you look at when we talk about other people's answers to that hypothetical question, they're all going to be based around some sense of justice, right? Like the guys that are making arguments in favor of eternal conscious torment, that are making conditionalists, like everybody is trying to argue that actually under some schema of rules, under some realization of what reality is, actually hell is fair. Even the people, even the Calvinists out there that are like, oh well, they make the play of, oh well, actually heaven's really unfair, so it's okay that hell is also unfair. Even that is an attempt to establish fairness, right? You're establishing an equivalency between how unfair heaven is, and so therefore it's fair for hell to also be unfair, right? And so, however anybody argues, they're going to be using intuitions of fairness, right? And I think whenever you understand what um, what my view calls for, I think it kind of handles the best of both worlds. I think a lot of people, whenever they're having this conditionalist versus uh, eternal conscious torment thing, and they think that these are the only two options, they think that they're trading on views of fairness. But I think if you adopt my view, I think you're actually able to take both views of fairness. To just say it like really quickly and succinctly, um, people that affirm eternal conscious torment think that it's fair for bad people to really suffer forever. And then on the conditional side, people think that it's also really fair that people are punished properly for the amount of like sin that they commit. My view does both of those things, right? Um,
Okay.
I forgot if there was another part of that question. Um, can you?
Um, I suppose it was again because why do you personally believe it?
Yeah.
Um,
Okay. So yeah. So the first one is the intuitions that I think it lines up with human intuitions uh th- better than the prevailing views right now. The other reason is that I think it also lines up with the biblical data um actually better than a lot of the other views because um more often than not I think that people are emphasize because a lot of the Bible in general has contradictory um, statements to describe a very complex or nebulous idea or thought. Like this happens all over the place. That's why we have the Trinity, right? That's why we have uh, theories about already and not yet. It's why we have wisdom literature that like will like speak to a fool, don't speak to a fool, right? That contradict because they're trying to describe something that's very complex. And that happens with hell as well, right? You have images of fire, but you also have images of outer darkness, and those are two different things, but they're attempts to describe the same thing. And I think most people with that are within these other views tend to um, highlight certain verses and tend to diminish other verses, and they're not doing a good job of trying to figure out how to balance those verses. And I think that if you adopt my view, I think that it actually balances a lot of these views much in a much better way. So yeah.
Um, I know that in the past you have extensively gone through the verses pertaining to these statements on hell. I don't know how much you have of that prepared tonight. If you have
So
any
so
like highlights that you want to go over with that.
yeah. So let me see. Let me see. So I actually found the document.
Oh, there you go.
Let me stop sharing and then let me re boom. Okay. And just for our group, I will probably share this document um on the server. Um uh this is a document that I made a while ago. Um, my hope is to actually, because my intention is to, I'd like to one day, write a book or something that's actually about all of this. And I want to go over every single verse that talks about the afterlife in the Bible. And so I have a document where I basically tried to do that. I don't think it has every single one. I know that it's missing them, a lot of them. And then I trimmed them down. And basically, what I then did is so in this document is uh, for all of the main views, I say whether or not that verse is consistent with that. Like, here's the verse. Is that view consistent with it? Is it not consistent with it? And then a little bit of commentary on why I think it is or is not consistent and all that stuff. Um, and so, yes, I do have this. Um, I
This is what I remember you having, so this is good.
Yes. So I will. Yeah. It actually took me kind of a long time to find it. Um. So I think for me, there's actually a few verses that talk about this, but for me, I think one of the verses that I think actually kind of makes that my view actually makes the most sense of is actually that so that for this video so we don't get super bogged down with it is First Jude 12 through 13. So I'll just read this really quick. These are the hidden reefs in your at your love feast. As they feast with you without fear, shepherds feeding themselves, waterless clouds, sleeping along by winds, fruitless trees in late autumn, twice dead, uprooted, wild waves of the sea, casting up foam from their own shame, wandering stars, for whom the gloom of outer darkness has been reserved forever. So uh, you can go read Jude. It's one chapter. It's super short. Um, this section is talking specifically about um, people that kind of like bring division into the church. And so it's very specifically talking about people. And now it is a subset of people. It's not all people that go to hell. Um, but it's using all of this colorful language to describe um, basically how terrible these these people are. And but it ends it though with for whom the gloom of the utter darkness has been reserved forever, right? And you it is a throwaway line, right? But there's other verses that talk about outer darkness. There's plenty of other verses that talk about outer darkness. There's plenty of and there's other verses that talk about like the gloomy darkness, right? Actually, there's one above here that's talking about the angels being committed to pits and gloomy darkness to be kept under, right, and all this stuff. Um, but the point that I want to highlight there is that um, so it's the gloom it's the gloom of the darkness, right? So it's the thing that's reserved for them is not just the darkness, right? It's not just their again. I'm trying to limit how much I talk about the other views, um, but it, it's not just a dead body being thrown into into a dark corner, right? That's not what it is, right? It's there's a psychological state that's associated with being in the darkness. It's gloomy, right? And so that requires there to be some level of consciousness involved there, right? And it's eternal, right? It's forever, right? And also, but also it is not um it's not centralized. It's not centralized in a like a location of fire. Now there are verses that talk about that, but it is uh um uh it is uh it's not contained to the point is that it's not contained to one area, and so that contained to the fact that it's not contained to one area to me indicates that there's a going out, right? That relates to this outer darkness thing and a movement away, right? And so to me to me this is one of those verses um, that uh, emphasizes points that line up with so again almost all of these like I don't think that there's like really a singular verse that is like works on my view and doesn't work on any of the other views, right? Like that just wouldn't make sense, right? Right? Because the competing views are out there because they at least make some view or they make at least make some sense of the data, right? And so like every verse is going to in some ways line up with at least one of the competing views. But for me, I think this one is one that is more closely described by what I'm talking about and how I'm thinking about it versus the other ones. Um, so that's a big one for me. Um,
Okay. Okay, so without
yeah,
going into more of them, because we can save that
yeah.
for more open questions later. I'm not going to pick through every verse
Well,
with you.
and it's also
Obviously,
something.
that extensive.
It's also something that that's sort of a long-term goal for mine and so really isn't something that necessarily needs to be done here, but I'm glad that we mentioned it just so that people know that that's um, an endeavor that like we wanted that I want to do. And so one of
Mhm.
the things that I want to do with this video is for people that watch in the future is if you have questions about it, particularly questions related to different verses and like how does your view fit with these verses, I'd really like for people to ask that. Mostly because it then gives me an excuse to actually get off my butt and like research it and think about it. So yeah,
Mhm. Okay. And this will be the last question before we open up. And I've got a couple questions that I came up with in the middle of this, and I'm sure if Christian's got questions, he can ask them too after we do this one. Um, And so, obviously, to be very cautious if you hear someone, even in the past couple 100 years, saying, "Oh, I've got a brand new view," or I've
Yes.
got a new view of some kind of theological idea." So, uh, why then has no one else figured this out or posited this kind of view prior to you?
Yeah, so in some ways I can't answer this specifically for prior to me, but I think I can, and I'll get into that, but I think I can answer in some ways in generally. And so I think um as Christians we believe in the concept of progressive revelation. Um but what I want to make clear is I do not think that this is what this is. I do think that God helped me like figure this out, but I think progressive revelation is something very specific, right? It is God revealing like his word. And I do not want to say that like my view on this is the word of the Lord or anything like that, right? It is one plausible view amongst many plausible views. And um, I think that it's certainly reasonable for people to have issues with my view and to not believe it. Um, but I think there's also a concept that doesn't really get talked about, which is progressive understanding. And I think it's pretty clear that Christians do also engage in progressive understanding. Um, we kind of have to, right? Because like one of the things that we even define as being a Christian is whether or not you affirm the Trinity, right? And obviously the word Trinity is not in the New Testament, right? It is a thing that came about through progressive understanding of Christians thinking about it over time. And we have this on a lot of things kind of no matter what denomination you're in. I know it's very popular for people to be like, "Oh no, we're all of us are exactly like the early Christians." I kind of don't care who you are. There's something that you do that is not quite like the early Christians. All of us have had some form of progressive understanding of how we interpret certain things in the scriptures. So I think that's what I'm engaging in. Now, as for why no one else figured it out beforehand, in large at a macro level, I think this has to do with just the fact of the human race hasn't been super um, competent in understanding how to deal with infinities. Um, we're finite creatures. We're used to dealing with finite mathematics and finite structures and all that other stuff. Um, it's only been even the last couple, like a lot of what I'm using in, you know, my analysis and my model, it comes from calculus, which is something that we've only had since Newton and Leibniz, right? Which is only the past couple hundred years. Um, so if you put it in in that frame, um, I'm I can be classified as within right if Augustus or not Augustus if Augustine is still an early church father even though he's 500 years after Christ, I'm within the time frame of being an early church father compared to like uh compared to Leibniz. um and so like um it you know, if the Lord tarries and Christians are around for a long period of time, it's entirely possible that, you know, this view could take off and be adopted by, you know, by people in the future. And I'm sure that there will be other things like that are just progressive understandings, new understandings of just how people, you know, deal with the biblical data. I mean, we have this about other things, right? You go into other fields of when people talk about like, um, so I know a growing field in like in biblical studies is un, um, unintended. What are they? The unintended coincidences or whatever, right? You have this whole line of thought that people are like, oh, actually. we can find unintended coincidences between the different gospel narratives and all of this stuff, and that leads to the historical reliability of the gospels and all this stuff. I think uh, my view should be kind of couched in more of those terms. Um, and uh, I, I now I think that somebody else could have figured it out. Um, I'm not quite sure why nobody in the last, um, few hundred years since Leibniz or whatever has applied these mathematical concepts to the idea of consciousness and all that stuff. But also, as the human race, we're still figuring out consciousness. I have, I am trying to spend more time thinking about, and this is something that would also go in like a future book of thinking about what does it mean to for a really long time have a lower level of consciousness. Um, this is actually something that uh, um, I'm still learning about and I'm still thinking about uh, because and we do have some research on that. I don't know if we want to get into that, but uh, it has to do with a point here, which I think I have it in here. It's called the let me see. I didn't think I was going to talk about this. Uh, it is called the critical flicker frequency. Um, it is the threshold is defined as the frequency at which a flickering light is distinguishable from a steady non-flickering light. So it's basically an experiment that they do that relates to how fast your eyes can see. Um, and basically, so for creatures like flies, and I might have this backwards. It goes one way or the other. I think it's for creatures like flies, it's like really high, and then for creatures like that are bigger. So, but also sometimes they're just made differently. So crocodiles and elephants and other things, it's lower, and basically, it makes you see the world differently. Um, and so like if you go see a crocodile at the zoo or whatever, like it's just like sitting there and it's not moving. And like we look at it and go, "Oh, like that crocodile must be bored." But actually, how that crocodile is interpreting the world is probably actually closer to like when we watch a sped up time lapse view, right? Like it, the way that that crocodile is experiencing the world is actually more like a time lapse video, right? Um, and so uh, basically, what it's doing is it's kind of entering this like lower. It's not hyper aware, right? Like a fly, though, a fly is hyper aware. Like that's why it's so hard to freaking hit a fly, right? Because it's super aware of what's going on, and it interprets the world faster. Um, and so, anyways, this is a thing I got from John Vervaeke, and he thinks that it is related to how conscious a being is related to how fast that they can interpret data. And
Okay.
I think there
This
might
is
be
this
some
is interesting.
plausibility. I think there's some plausibility to that. But yeah.
This is interesting, and that will relate to one of my questions that I had written
Oh,
down
okay.
later. But now I want to go ahead and open up that if anybody else has any questions, and go ahead and move on to more personal questions now.
Um, I'm processing,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
but but the day what it comes down to is like, like you said, we have to look at the scriptural data, which we really haven't done too much of yet.
Yep.
Um, that's more than anything what would I wouldn't say convince me, but it's not like I'm opposed to the view. I simply haven't thought about it too much until you started talking about it.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
so I think, in the coming weeks, we'll look at the scriptural data and see what it says.
And
And ultimately, like, every system is about what best accounts, what most naturally accounts for, all the data presented. Were you gonna say something?
Well, so I think one of the things that I'll do, which I'm sort of just thinking about this live, is I'll post um my Excel sheet, which kind of highlights those verses, and
Oh, cool.
maybe we can have you and Evan and some other people like take a look at them, and maybe try to develop um either questions for me, maybe you think my commentary on the verses are wrong or something like that, and and what we can either do is we can either as we go through, because the subsequent videos, I'm hoping that they can be about the a compare contrast between the main competing views: eternal conscious torment, conditionalism, and universalism. um, uh, so either we can do it in those, or um, we can just do another video. We can just do another session after that, where we're just hashing through biblical data, and and
Okay,
and
that's
seeing what
cool.
we can do from there. Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be great. So, all right, I have, I guess, I suppose, like questions. Although I know I'm gonna have more once I have time to actually think about this more. Um, so my first question would be, and this is not coming from a position of of disagreeing with what you're saying, but more just curious. Like, if this were not true,
Hmm.
uh, what would that? How would that your faith, if anything?
How would that
Or would
affect?
it just become kind of like a mystery? Like, okay, I just put this in the category of mystery that I don't understand.
Um. So I mean, I agreed with. So I never agreed with conditionalism. I was
Mhm.
always in the eternal conscious torment camp. Um, and
Okay.
so if I got convinced that this view was wrong, I'd probably just jump back to that. Now it would open up a little bit of can of worms in the fact of like what I mentioned before, which is I don't think that the eternal conscious torment view has a good accounting of that problem that I mentioned before of infinite punishment for finite sin. Um, uh, and I would then be forced, if I was convinced that this was wrong, I'd retreat back to eternal conscious torment. But then I'd be forced to be like, okay, I still need to find an answer to this question. And that would just be where
Okay.
that's just would be where I would be at, is trying to figure out, okay, what's a way that I can answer this
Okay.
without using the asymptotic view. And like I said,
You wouldn't view it as like some you wouldn't view it as something that, knocks you off your feet in terms of your faith
no,
per
no,
se?
no. I have, I have, well, at this stage, a lot of my issues, but throughout my life, usually the way that it goes is whenever I've found something that I'm like, oh, this is an issue with my faith, I just log it away and I go, okay, this is an issue with my faith. I need to think about this more and figure it out later. Um, but it doesn't, none of these like theological apologetics issues um, distract from or take away from the core reasons why I believe in Christianity, why I believe in Jesus. Um, and so uh, not knowing how they work is not going to keep me from that. Um,
Okay.
there's plenty of things that like I don't know how they work. Um,
Yeah, I
Yeah.
wanna add
Yeah.
yeah.
here that I think that, as you mentioned, that the whole thought process behind this even came out of the kind of apologetics space and looking for answers,
Yes.
like, or adequate answers from, like, non-believers, but I think even you would posit that, and this is probably a large reason why more work and effort into coming up with different views to cover this kind of issue aren't really focused on is because I think a mature believer would kind of in a very like Job sense be like, all right, I don't have to understand it. And
Yes.
um it doesn't it doesn't do that. It doesn't knock you off your feet in your faith.
Yeah.
Um
Yeah, that's actually a
because
really good point. Yeah.
like with the understanding that, oh, there are just some things that are out of my realm of understanding. I think this was my thought process as you were talking about it earlier. That largely, um, unless you're, a fire and brimstone type preacher where you need to kind of like dress up hell and kind of like at least make talking about it sexy in a way, where it's relevant. Um, then you don't need to contemplate hell as much. And so a kind of more mature believer, since this issue doesn't necessarily affect them as much, they are not going to make the effort to posit it. Now, when it's in the apologetic space where we're looking for adequate answers, fundamentally we have to believe that there are always going to be an adequate answer. We just don't understand necessarily yet, perhaps. Um, and a mature believer can take that and just be like, I don't have to understand everything. But it doesn't mean that it's not understandable.
Right.
Um, yeah, that's what I would say for all that.
Yeah, no,
I agree. That's good. Yeah.
I think actually I think of that point like that kind of reminds me of the idea of like um a lot of people know how to use a phone, but not a lot of people know how to program a phone, right? Because they don't need to, right? Like they have the basics together and they know how to do it, and so they can go about and live their lives never knowing how to program a phone. But if you're in the space of people that program phones, there's going to be issues that people in that realm pretty much only them know about and only them think about, and then they come up with solutions and they apply that solution, and really only people that are in the phone programming community, as it were, really debate or talk about that. And in some ways this falls into that camp of like the vast majority of people are not really dealing with this on a day-to-day basis, even though it does kind of um, intuitively end up affecting their lives. And it's actually very similar to the Arminianism versus Calvinism debate, right? Like that's a debate that's been raging for hundreds of years now, and almost everybody actually has an opinion about that. It's just normie Christians don't know that they have an opinion because they don't get involved with apologetics, and so they don't talk about it, right? Like if they get thrust into a Bible study where people are arguing about it, they'll have an opinion about it, but that's not a thing that they're focusing on because for most people that doesn't that doesn't actually have
A
anything to
lot of
do with
times
their
they have
lives. Yeah.
interestingly, a lot of times you have disjointed opinions and you don't really even
Yes.
realize it. Like, so, like, like, for example, and this is a totally different subject, but I'm just making a point is that, like, I know people that, like, I know dispensationalists who don't realize they're dispensationalists
Yes. Yes.
because,
Exactly.
like, that's pretty much what they were taught their whole lives. And they didn't realize, okay, there are other potential options, even beyond just like a simple amillennialist or post-millennialist view. Like there are other options, and they don't even realize. Like so, like I've talked to some people, and they're like, you know, it's really strange because, in one sense, they'll be like, oh yeah, I spiritualize all the prophecies, but I'm still dispensationalist. I'm like, you kind of are and you kind of aren't. You don't even
Yes.
know what you are. You
Yes.
just kind of like you've put together this hodgepodge of data and kind of you don't even know what you fully believe or what system that um you've bought into. But anyways, I do you mind if I ask one last
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
question? It's a pretty quick one. So we're Evan brought up the whole historical side of things, like, has anybody ever thought of this? And sometimes what we see before there's a fully developed views, we see kind of like a seed form of it. And I'd be curious if you're aware of any kind of seed form of this view. Not to say that that's, the most important thing. I'm just curious.
And I am too. In all honesty, um, which is part of the reason why I enrolled in seminary school and started, because part of me wanted to know, has anyone else thought of this previously? And um, as far as I can tell, no. Now, plenty of people do have their own idiosyncratic views of hell. Um, I have asked, I've submitted YouTube chat questions to various people in the Christian apologetics circles about this. That's also kind of one of the reasons why I want to have this recorded, and why I want to I want to try and do I want to try to have a better video that I can send people to talk about this, because I do actually genuinely want to know, has someone else thought of it along these lines? Has anyone done any like deep dive and fleshing out of a view that's similar to this? And the closest that I've heard is um uh ideas about that usually in some way involve degradation of some sort. So like mine is specifically degradation of consciousness and how that applies to suffering, um and 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 all of that. But it is pretty common that people will apply some kind of idea of degradation of the soul or degradation of the person. um and actually, I'm not sure if we're going to talk about it. We could talk about it. So the fourth view that's in the book, Four Views of Hell, is about C.S. Lewis's view of hell. And in that, um, so it's in a book called The Great Divorce. You can get it on audiobook or Kindle or whatever, your whatever. Um, and in that, he conceives of uh, heaven, um, and hell in terms of how large you are as a person. Um, and so to him, like, uh, kind of the way that he imagines it is like you have this space of heaven, and hell is a crack that's inside of heaven, or that's inside of heaven. And in order to get into hell, you have to become smaller and smaller and smaller. And so and I'm explaining it that way to help you understand it, but actually whenever you read the book, he actually starts in hell. The character, there's a character that starts in hell, and he rides a bus, and it talks about the bus going up into the air. And but he realizes that as the bus is going up into the air, the bus actually isn't going up into the air. The bus is getting bigger, and it gets bigger, and it's eventually in a canyon. And then eventually it's outside of that canyon, and he realizes that the canyon that he just came from is actually just a crack. And uh so so again, I didn't necessarily want this to be me. I could talk more about it, but what I would say is that C.S. Lewis's view also has this kind of idea of degradation and getting smaller or larger, but he imagines that you can kind of go up and down it, um, during your time in hell, which I don't have any. I don't. My view doesn't really go in that direction, and he's also doing it for other reasons. So that's probably the closest that I can say for what I know of for how my view sort of relates to other people's view, but I don't know if
Incidentally, I think we've talked about this before. An image of this kind of version of hell can be seen in uh, Davy Jones' ship and crew in terms of Pirates of the
Yes,
Caribbean.
yes,
Um,
yes. That is, yeah, I have used that before. That in some ways, I think another way to kind of almost imagine it, but it doesn't kind of work, is if you think about the Pirates of the Caribbean movie, the one where Davy Jones has the ship, and uh, Will Turner's dad is like a part of the ship, and while he's a part of the ship, he's not dead. Well, he is actually, I guess, but like he's kind of dead, not dead. He's in this like half dead state, but he's like a lower level of consciousness, and he can kind of wake up for like a second and kind of become semi aware, but then like he comes like back down, and so that sort of idea, and Dave, and obviously Davy Jones's locker and the crew is supposed to be kind of an analogy to hell. So there, I think that this sort of idea has been in people's possible imaginings of how they imagine hell, but I don't think anyone has applied it in the way that I'm applying it.
Okay, that's all
all
I
right,
got.
I've got a couple that we'll see if we can do quickly. Um, so, and this is from the discussion that we just had, thoughts that I had while we were talking. So one of the things that this view does is you have to accept an axiom here, which is that consciousness is continuous.
Yes.
Um, and so you also mentioned Vervaeke, and so that kind of comes up on this. So how does your view of like levels of consciousness or spectrum of consciousness affect your view of daily life, daily living, and thoughts on stuff like a flow state,
Mm.
that kind of idea, because that's also a Vervaeke kind
Yeah.
of
The
thought.
Well, I don't think that's solely a Vervaeke thing. Lots of
I
people
know
do
it's
that.
not, but I think he talks about it a lot.
Yeah. Um, I mean, I think it would just lend more credence to, my idea that the axiom is true, right? Because part of the idea of, and really, it doesn't even necessarily need to be higher or lower. I mean, whichever way you quantify, because so in some ways, I think for Vaki would quantify, and I think most people would quantify like being in a flow state as being a higher form of consciousness, because you're kind of like, and most of them see it as you're getting your body kind of in tune with your conscious state, right? And so that's why a lot of people have like flows, right? This is like your runner's high, right? And this is where you're playing soccer and you're just, or you're fighting and you're doing the or Last Samurai, no thank, right? No, right, like just do the motion, like don't think, because like your body knows it. And so, but then whenever your body knows it and your mind knows it too, and like you've kind of like entered this this thing, um that's sort of, I agree that that is sort of a flow state. I also think that in some ways, there's a sort of a flow state like thing that's less than. And for me, I imagine this like with driving, right? So like you have you have these instances where you're driving and you just completely forgot what you did for the last like 5 minutes. And I've had it before where um, I've been super sleep deprived and I have literally blacked out on my way driving to class, and I fully navigated multiple, streetlights and turns and all of this stuff, and I don't remember any of it, and I was completely blacked out. And to me, that's like an intermediate stage of consciousness. And so, in some ways, for as far as this view is concerned, I don't think I necessarily have to figure out how those factor in, just that they lend they lend more evidence to support the idea of consciousness isn't just one steady state. It's not. I think whenever you think about that idea, either just on a daily basis or at a very deep level, like for Vicky and all these guys are doing, it I think it just lends to the to the argument that, and again, I don't know if different levels is the way. I don't think that's the right term, but that there's um, like different percentages that we're aware and that we live and exist and have our being. And if that's true, then that axiom is true. Um,
Um,
I don't know if I answered your
and then
question, but yeah.
no, it does. There, because actually, yeah, the more examples that you have, from anecdotal experience to then also like studies into things like flow state or drunkenness or any kind of thing. I think that's more supplemental material that supports what you're trying to say as opposed to an on-off switch to consciousness.
And I
I
think
think
if
that's
you
fair.
I think if you wanted to prove that axiom wrong, I think you'd have a lot harder time proving the axiom wrong than just agreeing that it's true, right? Like
Yeah,
you'd have to show that you'd have to show that consciousness or like flow state, sleep, whatever that in between thing that I was just describing is, you'd have to say that all of those are the same level of conscious awareness, and that just doesn't make sense, right? I
interestingly, that this is also making me think of like I think Peugeot not long ago in a video was talking about variations of like methods in which people do divination because he also looks at like AI as like a type like a form of
Yeah, yeah,
divination.
yeah, yeah, for sure.
Um, but that's something that people would try and do, and that even Isaac Newton would do is that to try and like catch an idea, he would try to induce like the edge of
Yeah, yeah,
sleep
yeah, yeah,
and
yeah,
like startle himself into it as a
yeah.
form of trying to hold on to something that's more uncertain or isn't necessarily graspable at a certain level of consciousness. So I think that again, even in that sense, there's a way in which you can talk about um, variations in consciousness and states, and there's more. I think I'm throwing that in there to say there's also some symbolic weight that there is to that as well. Um, okay, my last question, and this kind of has to do more than uh, instead of poking at the axiom of consciousness of as being continuous, instead looking at the idea of suffering, because as you're defining it, um, though we haven't gone quickly into what you're defining it, I wonder how suffering is accounted for in terms of stuff as well as like mental anguish. Because I also think that some of these in between liminal states of consciousness, some of the times I experience some of the worst mental anguish because you have the
Mm-hmm.
most confusion about what's going on. And so while you posit, I think correctly, that if you continuously go down in terms of levels of consciousness or percentages of consciousness, physical torment may diminish, but mental anguish might increase. So how does that
Mm.
kind of balance out?
I mean, the thing is so that's the exact sort of a question that I have not thought of yet. And I mean, just at first brush, it's like, yeah, that is a potential like defeater in uh how you understand it. Um, I guess my first reaction to it would be um to say that I'm making an assumption, right? That like I agree that I'm making an assumption that um the that suffering equation, right? So that suffering equation is uh would be suffering is proportional to consciousness times or level of consciousness times time. And yeah, it if it does in fact go the other way, that that does put a wrench into it. But I think, like I said, my first defense might be that if you assume that uh, in order for me to actually be wrong and for your critique to hold, um, the level of mental anguish would need to um, continuously go. It would need to continuously be inverted, right?
Right.
So, for example, part of the problem with that is I think if your consciousness is 0%, I don't think you have any mental anguish, right?
Mhm.
Um, and so that like that would be my first level of defense. Now, the comeback to be is, well, on your view, you never reach 0% of consciousness,
I,
right?
I guess something you could do is say that okay, the, the asymptote is more of like a trend line, right? And
Well,
obviously the
that's what
actual
it is,
experiences
yeah.
would be more spiky. Uh, and
Well, and so what basically what the argument would be is that right. So if we go back and we look at um oh my gosh, where's my here? If we go back and we look at my graph here, right? Yes, to what you just said, you might have spikes that kind of pop up into it. But as long as at some point in time you eventually just have you eventually you stop having the spikes and you just have the slope down, it still converges. And so
yeah,
it still works with the view. Um and so yeah, that's basically what that would basically need to be the argument that I have to make is, and I actually think that in some ways I can make it, um, because if uh, most of the time that you're dreaming, period, right, like the thing that you're talking about can really only apply to whenever you're dreaming, right?
mhm.
Um, when you're dreaming, m- again, kind of a layman's understanding of this, but I believe how this works is most of the time whenever you're dreaming, it's actually whenever you are in that transition phase of coming like uh, entering awakeness versus going into like that deep like REM sleep thing. And so what you could say is, yeah, you might enter a mid phase of sleep where your mental anguish does go up because you're having a nightmare and you're having bad dreams and all this stuff. Um, but if you're actually in like your deep REM sleep, that would probably be a lower level of conscious, and you're actually not experiencing you're not dreaming, right? um and I think that would even kind of go along with a lot of Vervaeke's stuff, because again,
Yeah.
he has this idea of that consciousness is related to speed, and so then you get into, do robots dream and do AIs dream and all of this stuff. And I think his argument, which I don't agree with, by the way, but his argument is that, for reasons that we won't talk about in this video, but his argument is like, well, if the AI could like think, if the information could go fast enough, it could like dream or whatever.
Mhm.
And
Um,
that would be, and for him that would be an elevation of consciousness, right? And so that would mean that the AI state that it's in right now is a lower state,
I
however you
have
parse
one
that.
other
Yeah.
counter to my critique, which would be then to go into the biblical literature and be like, okay, does suffering actually also include mental torment, like mental anguish in it, or is it more like a not physical necessarily, but like in terms of physical or um, spiritual kind of punishment idea, the whole gnashing of teeth idea. Um, and if the biblical you know sources don't actually also have like a robust definition of suffering, and perhaps
Yeah.
mental anguish doesn't actually apply. That could be the other way tack I think you
Yeah,
could
but I
potentially.
don't think I would take that route because again, that the way I go with human intuition a lot, and I think it's a pretty common human intuition that mental suffering also counts for something. Um,
Yeah.
and to, if it didn't, the worst the worst punishment that we give to criminals wouldn't be solitary confinement, right? Like there's a reason why
Mhm.
solitary confinement is the worst punishment we give to criminals. Like is because we think that the mental anguish that they suffer while going through that is actually worth something. Um,
Mhm.
so yeah, I don't think that would be the route that I would go with it.
Yeah. Okay. Um, that's all my questions. I'm pretty sure. So there's nothing else.
We good, Christian? We good, Miles?
You're good.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I will end it there. Thank you.